Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us, and a really warm welcome to today's Research Talks webinar. I'm hosted by us, Steer, and the Active Travel Academy at Westminster University in honour of International Women's Day, which was on Saturday. I'm Dom Smith, and I've got the pleasure of being the UK Active Travel Lead for Steer. And for the next hour or so, we're going to delve into some of the key barriers preventing more women from cycling through different stages of their lives and explore actionable solutions to reverse those trends. If you've attended any of these previous Research Talk events, you'll know that Steer is excited to be partnering with the Active Travel Academy at the University of Westminster, with the aim of empowering active travel practitioners by making academic research more accessible. And one of the ways of doing this is by hosting these sessions, which we hope you'll find helpful and give you direct access to academic researchers and their findings. Far fewer women ride bikes than men in most developed countries. The exceptions are generally only those with highly developed cycling infrastructure, the Denmarks and Netherlands of this world. And if we want to get more people cycling in pursuit of climate change, air quality and public health goals, we need to understand why women don't cycle currently and what might support women to cycle more. So to mark International Women's Day, we thought we should bring together a number of researchers in this field to share their findings and support us as practitioners in understanding what we can do to enable more women to ride bikes. We'll hear from three speakers today. Firstly, Dr. Robert Egan is an interdisciplinary researcher from the Centre for Transport Research at Trinity College Dublin. His work explores cycling in low cycling contexts with a focus on Ireland, and he'll be talking about his research into why teenage girls are 10 times less likely to cycle to school than boys, influenced by societal expectations around femininity, peer dynamics, cultural norms that often frame cycling as a boys-only activity. Then he'll hand over to Dr. Dawn Rahman, who is a principal consultant at Integrated Transport Planning, with experience of working for local authorities and non-profit organisations delivering transport projects and travel behaviour schemes. Dawn recently completed her PhD with the Active Travel Academy, titled Mad or Magnificent? Mothers Who Cycle with Their Children. And Dawn will be helping us to explore the issues that most cycling infrastructure fails to accommodate parents and disproportionately affecting women, as they still tend to be primary caregivers. And then finally, Kate Bartlett, who's a current PhD student at the Active Travel Academy, and she's researching how cycling and rail stages are combined in single trips and the potential to increase this as a combined mode. She's also an active travel campaigner with the Women's Network of the London Cycling Campaign, which is working to ensure cycling is an inclusive mode of transport that men and women use equally across London by 2030. Kate will be discussing with us her research that many cycleways feel unsafe to women in London, particularly those running alongside parks, railways and canals where poor visibility and isolation heighten safety concerns. So without further ado, I will invite Robbie to kick us off. In terms of questions, there are a large number of people on the call, so we're going to manage that through the chat, if that's all right. So you can see the comments bar in the comments icon in the top right-hand side of your screen. So if you've got a question you'd like to ask, please type it in the chat box at the top of the screen, and we'll put as many of those as time allows, which I'll put to our panelists at the end of the session. So over to you, Robbie.
Thanks very much, Dom. Great, so I'll just get my slides open. Oh, great, here we go. So thank you very much to Steer and the Active Travel Academy for the invite to talk about this. So today I'm going to talk about some research that was carried out in Ireland looking at social norms and particularly gender norms in Irish second level education institutions where cycling was socially represented and practiced as a boys' thing. And this work was carried out by myself and Jane Hackett when we were both in Green Schools Travel, which was part of an environmental NGO called Antashka. So some of you may be familiar with Green Schools, Eco Schools, and it originated from the Anti-Cycles campaign, which you can also see now run by Sustrans. So it's been very successful so far in terms of rolling out as a campaign. And you can read our late abstract if you're more interested, or late summary on the Active Travel Studies website if you want to learn more about this research. So, yeah, so I'll just provide a bit of background to get going. So the anti-cycles campaign was set up to explore and address the second level cycling gender gap in Ireland, which is extremely pronounced. So when it begun, there was some kind of recent census data that gathered the mode to school for teenage girls and teenage boys in 2016, and it was around 1 in 10 of those who cycled to school were teenage girls. This gender gap is slightly smaller now from more recent data from 2022, but it's still 1 in 8, which I imagine is one of the biggest gender gaps for a mode across various social groups and ages. So this particular campaign and the research that we carried out that I'm talking about today, it originated from that question: what explains this gender gap? What is going on? And how can we address it? And we used a method called grounded theory to try and help answer this and structure how we would investigate this or explore this. And grounded theory is effectively an exploratory qualitative method that's very useful for trying to create explanations of broader social processes based on interview accounts, focus groups. And in this particular case, we chose focus groups as probably the most sensitive and most peer support enabling type of data collection method we could use. And as well, we drew on various kinds of theory that's already out there around gender theorists such as Judith Butler, Raymond Collin, looking at the likes of masculinity and femininity and different kinds of masculinities and femininities and how they can shape various kinds of behaviors. And there's a lot of excellent research out there, such as Kirsty Wiles, that was presented just recently on a webinar looking at gender and cycling more broadly. So we were influenced by some of this work, and we carried out in total 17 semi-structured focus groups. 15 of these were carried out with teenage girls only to provide a safe environment for them to talk about what could be potentially sensitive issues, and then 2 of them were carried out with teenage boys to try and get a sense of the other elements of cycling as a kind of masculine practice as it emerged throughout the study. Generally, we had around 3 to 12 participants in each focus group, and there were a range of locations. So this was a nationwide study. We carried out research in the likes of Limerick, Cork, and Galway. So we had a kind of national coverage overall, and we had a range of ages and years. So we found that actually there were kind of different representations and experiences of cycling based on age, which you would expect. And this was quite important, as I'll show later on. And just one other mention, this was carried out, some of the data collection with this was carried out with the Green Schools travel team, and also was supported by many of the teachers across the different schools in Ireland. So just to say thanks to them, they were a really important part of this research. So a boys thing. So we found, in the words of one of the female participants in one of the focus groups, that cycling was understood broadly as a boys thing, something that was for boys and something that was practiced by boys. The people coming to school generally were boys, and usually groups of boys, in fact. And what was particularly interesting about this, based on what some of the teenage girls were talking about in the focus groups, is that for many in primary school, cycling wasn't such a gendered thing. It was considered something that was relatively normal or natural, as a word that one of the participants used, for both girls and boys to cycle to school. And that's not to say that there wasn't gendered elements to this cycling. For example, different types of bicycles and associations with different types of bicycles, like tassels or pink color or mountain bikes. But it was something, there was space for both girls and boys in primary school to engage in cycling. And it seems that with the emergence of second level, and then for many teenage students, adolescence and puberty, dominant notions of being feminine in an appropriately adolescent way and being masculine appear to emerge. And this had a real bearing on cycling and its social acceptability for different groups. And as one particular participant described, while they may have described cycling as natural for them to engage in while they were in primary school, suddenly cycling becomes just their nature for teenage boys to engage in, and something that was very deviant for teenage girls to engage in. How we tried to explain or explore what was going on in this particular case for teenage girls. We found that achieving femininity or particular kind of gender norms around being a teenage girl that you're meant to comply with as a teenage girl were highly incompatible with the practice of cycling in Ireland as it's currently constituted. And often this was indicated or implied by the sense of comfort and discomfort or lack of self-consciousness or intensity of self-consciousness when engaging in particular kinds of mobility practices. So we found four in particular that were very influential or appeared to be very influential for the comfort of cycling for teenage girls. One of these was modesty. So this related with concealing or covering up one's sexualized physical features as a teenage girl in second level. So one important aspect of this that was mentioned by some of the participants was the mandatory skirt in some cases. Where some of the schools had that as something that you had to wear, and others there was a bit more flexibility. But more or less, all of the participants did wear skirts to school, and they talked around the practicalities or the concerns around the wind blowing the skirt up when cycling, the sense of being looked at, the sense of people seeing things or seeing parts of their body they wanted to cover it up. And even more influential in some cases was the actual position certain types of bikes would put people in. So like having bikes with a high crossbar and having to put your leg over it, cycling up a hill and being on an incline. And then as well, another important aspect was, as I mentioned, many of the schools had groups of teenage boys cycling to school. Cycling to school as a teenage girl put a lot of participants in a very kind of isolated space, so made them hyper visible in this public space. And this was seen as something that went against their levels of comfort when cycling. So second then was beauty, which related with a very kind of feminized version of beauty and a traditionally feminine, presentable form of hair. So for a lot of the teenage girls, they talked about having long hair and keeping long hair in a certain kind of presentable form was very important. And that cycling was something that was highly incompatible with this practice, particularly a type of cycling where it was expected you would wear a helmet by parents or by others. And then, of course, the skirt, as I mentioned, there were some practical challenges then cycling with the skirt. For example, getting a caught in the chain was a concern. Being destabilized and trying to cover up while being on the move cycling was also a concern. So this was something as well that was felt to go very much against that. And a lot of the teenage girls felt like they had no choice but to wear the skirt, even in schools where trousers were an option. And then third, we come to continence, which related with the regulation of bodily odors and sweat in this particular case. Menstruation wasn't mentioned in the focus groups, but was likely based on other research that's been done by many researchers. Could be also an issue, but that was maybe too taboo to bring up in the first place. But in terms of looking at sweat in particular and perspiration, speed was talked about and the weight of bags or carrying different things to school. But when we probed further into these particular experience in focus groups, we actually found that sweat, a concern with sweating, with getting so warm that you would sweat whether wearing a helmet or not, was something that was really off-putting. And some participants talked about how there were different norms applied for boys, or that that boys were held to, or standards or expectations around body odor that girls weren't expected to be held to. So there was a sense of stigma if you were smelling or if you're sweating as a teenage girl cycling into school. And this is important to point out, as a lot of the cycling in Ireland is usually a fast kind of cycling, or it's a fast cycling culture, in other words. So the practice of cycling in this case was seen as highly incompatible with not sweating in the first place. So lastly, then we have caution. So there were fears amongst many of the teenage girls around theft, around being destabilized, about following the rules, and about being disregarded by drivers and dealing with kind of driver aggression that just didn't come up with any of the teenage boys in the study. So I'll move through this quickly, about 10 minutes. So next we found that cycling was a means for a lot of teenage boys of exemplifying masculinity. So in one respect, this related to actually just engaging in cycling in the first place, as it was seen as a boys thing. But in another respect, there was a certain kind of style of cycling that was seen as a way of showing off how masculine you are, how much you fit in as a teenage boy in these particular contexts. So one of these was athleticism. Cycling at a kind of fast pace. Some particular participants described the boys that they saw cycling to school as Hell's Angels, which kind of gives a very hypermasculine image to cycling. So one of the teenage boys in one of the focus groups talked about how a girl cycling or a girl cycling fast was something that was felt to show up a guy. So it was seen as a kind of challenge to their masculinity to encounter teenage girls cycling, particularly at pace. And one of the teenage girls who did cycle to school, she talked around about how she felt the need to prove herself when cycling, to keep pace with boys or to overtake them. And in some cases, she even mentioned she was challenged to a race while cycling to school by other teenage boys. Second, then we moved to audacity, which was a willingness to take bold risks. So cycling on the road was seen as something that was in some cases dangerous. So actually, it was already an expression of how fearless someone was. Not wearing a helmet, cycling with no hands, engaging in wheelies, and more or less cycling in a fast kind of style as well was seen as a way to kind of show off. And some of the teenage girls talked about how they saw boys trying to show off by doing wheelies beside them, for example. Lastly, then we had indifference, which related with a kind of not caring while on the road or cycling. So a kind of disdain for rules of the road, a kind of emotional coolness around cycling, and fear of motor traffic that was hugely contrasted with the teenage girls' accounts of cycling or their perceptions of cycling. So I'm actually just going to move to the recommendations just so we have more time for the other speakers. But as I said, the lay summary is there if you want to read it, and particularly as I've shown, there are kind of a whole range of gender norms that affect cycling and affect how teenage girls how accessible cycling is for teenage girls in Ireland. And one of the aspects of this is that a lot of these norms are actually heavily regulated, whether that's by parents, by other teenage girls, teenage boys in particular, was a really big one. So a question of what to do has to look at the norms as well as the kinds of conditions that we have for cycling in Ireland at the moment, which I think are also quite applicable to the conditions for cycling in the UK. So one way to look at this would be to try and make cycling more compatible with the norms that or expectations that teenage girls are held to. So one way to do this is to develop protected and directed cycle networks, as many researchers and campaigners argue for, that enable more social, more slow, lower sweat, helmet-free cycling to school. Another is to actually support teenage girls to politically challenge the entrenched culture of masculinized cycling and the restrictive norms we've outlined that they broadly face in their everyday experiences of cycling or wanting to cycle to school. And then lastly, looking at creating safety in numbers, creating this kind of critical mass of teenage girls cycling to school so it's not this isolated activity that's stigmatized. And then targeting interventions to increase participation amongst older years, because this seemed to be quite influential on the perceptions of cycling for the younger years at this transition period of moving from primary school to secondary school. So that leaves me, yeah, that's good. I'll stop there. Thanks. Oh, sorry. Passing on to Don.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to talk about my recent PhD that I've conducted, looking at how mothers cycle in the UK with their children. And I focused on children aged 11 and under, on the premise that normally that age child is still escorted by a parent for most journeys. I wanted to look at those who do cycle rather than looking at why women or why mothers don't cycle, because I feel there's already been quite a lot of research done on that. And actually the barriers haven't changed over the last 4 to 5 decades. In terms of women generally lack confidence to cycle, don't want to mix with motorised vehicles, and also in relation to mothers, they often carry out care duties. They don't just sort of travel from A to B, they do multi-stop trips. And so they're all given as reasons as to why mothers don't cycle in the UK in particular. So I wanted to look instead at mothers who are cycling to maybe try and understand how they're overcoming those various barriers, in the hope that that might actually help inform future policy to get cycling more diverse. So I did a mixed methods research. The first thing I did was to conduct some focus groups with what I deemed influential women who work in family cycling. So women who work for organisations like Sustrans, Cycling UK, Cycle Sprague, British Cycling, people who campaign for cycling. And the idea was that I wanted to put together a questionnaire that I would then distribute to mothers across the whole of the UK. And I also kind of wanted it to be a bit of a sense check, because I cycle with my son and have done since he was 7 weeks old. And so I was already coming to this research with some predetermined ideas of what I thought the issues might be. But it was a really useful process, because actually there were lots of things that I hadn't thought about, particularly as I just have the one child, so I hadn't really thought about the logistics of what it's like cycling with children of different ages, or cycling with 2 or 3 children. So that was a really useful process. And that then helped inform the questionnaire that I put together. The questionnaire was distributed on social media, so mainly Facebook and what was then Twitter. For a mother to take part, they had to have a child or children aged 11 and under. They needed to be regular cyclists, so I wanted someone that cycled at least twice a month, and they had to live in the UK. And when it was open for a 3-week period, and at the end of that 3-week period, just under 1,400 people had responded, which was great. The types of things I was interested in finding out about was the types of cycles they were using. So were they cycling with their bikes on were they cycling with their children on their own bikes, or were they using child carrying cycles, so cargo bikes, trailers? How much they'd spent on their bikes, where they were storing them at home, the types of infrastructure they felt comfortable riding on with their children, whether they were experiencing negative, positive incidents, or both, what their main motivations were for cycling, and then also ask some general socio-demographic questions. Okay, and it was really important for me within this research to make a big distinction between child carrying cycles and independent cycling. So again, from my own experience, when I used to cycle with my son in a cargo bike, he was a passenger, so I was effectively in charge of the journey. I didn't have to worry about what he was doing, whereas when he got to like 3 or 4 and he could ride his own bike alongside me, I would definitely not use the same types of infrastructure. And so I was really keen to see if that was the same for other mothers. I then carried out 30 interviews with mothers who had filled out the survey. Again, wanted to get a really good mix of people, so mothers that were using different types of cycles, mothers that had 1 child or 2, 3 and 4 children, different parenting statuses. And then I was really keen to try and speak to people from all across the UK, but also from people who lived in cities, suburbs and rural areas, to see if that made a difference. Okay, for the interviews, really wanted to sort of just drill down and get a lot more detail about the types of infrastructure they were using with their children, whether they were confident cyclists. So again, I went in with a predetermined idea that I figure that most of the people cycling with their children would be confident cyclists, because if you're not confident cycling on your own, then it's unlikely that you would do it with a child in tow. Also, because of those care duties and multi-stop trips, I wanted to find out how mothers were overcoming the logistics of cycling with their children, but also then working and carrying out care duties. And then in terms of the social demographic traits of the mothers that I surveyed, it was a very narrow demographic. So they were highly educated, most of them were in employment, of a high income, and overwhelmingly from a white background. Now, obviously it was purposely sampled, so you could argue that this is not necessarily representative of mothers who cycle across the UK, but in comparison with other literature that has been done and other research, it does kind of mirror that most cyclists in the UK tend to be quite affluent and from a white background. So one of the first things I wanted to do was actually to see what sort of meanings mothers assign to their practice of cycling. And it was great that they did assign positive meanings, and that kind of makes sense, because if you are cycling all the time and you never have any positive associations with that, it's probably not something that you're going to continue to do. So a lot of the mothers, they did talk about the sheer joy they got from cycling with their children and how it was a really nice experience to like bond with them emotionally. And then also from sort of a physical and mental health point of view. Interestingly, a lot of mothers did say it was a convenient mode of transport, which kind of goes against a lot of the previous research. So that was really interesting. But there were a few caveats that it was only convenient on days where they were perhaps working from home or not having to go into an office. Unfortunately, there were a lot of negative meanings, and most of these, perhaps unsurprisingly, came from their interactions with other road users. So and a lot of the mothers had experienced dangerous driving around them, close passes, verbal abuse, and this in itself then made cycling quite stressful for them. There was also a lot of discussions about how they felt judged by other people, both in terms of kind of like passive aggressive judging, where like friends or families would be like, oh, you're so brave to cycle, or oh, you do know that road's quite busy. But then also to having strangers shout out of vehicles saying you're putting your child in danger, etc. So that was really disappointing, but again, not unsurprising. But what came out of this is that they were able to overcome those negative incidents because they were really highly motivated to cycle. So these were women and mothers that really wanted to cycle, and they really saw that as something important to them to do. And I think that's how they were able to sort of rationalize those bad things when they happened. That's not to say that some mothers didn't have to have a break from their cycling if they'd experienced a particularly nasty incident with somebody, but they were able to sort of have a think about it, take a breather, and then maybe go back to it a week later. But I think this is really important to stress that, until we can change some of the infrastructure and the culture around cycling, that we're not going to get more mothers and women cycling until we can fix those things, because if they're not that highly motivated, cycling is just going to be too difficult for them. And the other thing that came out is that cycling wasn't easy. It was something that took and required, for most mothers, a lot of planning, and they were having to go above and beyond what we would consider normal actions to be able to cycle. So a number of mothers that I spoke to carried out the school run. They would often leave 20 to 30 minutes earlier than they needed to, just so that they could get to school and avoid the general chaos around the school gates from other parents driving. People were having to buy things like ramps if they lived in flats to be able to push their bike up, and often having to take bikes apart. So in terms of the infrastructure that mothers were happy or comfortable to cycle on, for those who were riding with their children on their own bikes, there wasn't, they did not want to cycle on busy roads, and that, absolutely makes sense. So there was definitely a preference for shared use paths, but they often came into conflict with dogs on extendable leads, or you've got wobbly children and dogs that don't walk in a straight line, and so that often could be a matter of conflict. What I did find quite surprising was the high number of mothers who were using pavements and footways, and that might be because the research was across the whole of the UK. A number of places that mothers were living in, there just was no cycle infrastructure at all. So they said that's the only way that they could cycle with their child. But then that, in its sense, brought those feelings of being judged again, because they know that technically adults aren't allowed to cycle on the pavement. And so sometimes they came into conflict with pedestrians because of that. For mothers riding child carrying cycles, so your cargo bikes, trailers, etc., they were happy to ride on quiet roads, but this could become quite problematic if they were roads with traffic calming, so chicanes or speed humps, just because of the nature of their bikes. If they're towing a trailer and you've got like the small bumps and they don't quite go over them, so it could tip the children. They really wanted to use shared use paths, but there's still so many in the UK with guardrail barriers or steps or bollards that they just couldn't guarantee that if they chose a new route in particular, that they'd be able to exit it. So that was a real issue. And then also painted cycle lanes were not particularly popular, again because most child carrying cycles have quite a wide footprint, so often that would mean that their bicycle was outside of the painted white line, which could then bring them into conflict with other road users. and also that often when you get to a junction, the painted lines kind of just stops and it kind of brings you back in with other road users, which could cause contentions. And it was really clear, again, that particularly those mothers that did use the roads, even those that didn't want to, sometimes they had to, because very few people have a cycle path that runs from their house to where they need to go to. So they were saying that this often brought them into conflict with other people. My own experience, why my present PhD was called Mad or Magnificent, was because I had someone shout out of a window at me that I was mad and I was, causing harm to my son because I was cycling with him. And I wasn't alone in that. A number of the mothers did share that, they had been shouted at or abused. And it's really upsetting because it's bad enough if you're on your own cycling and someone shouts at you. But when you've got a young child or your children with you, it's even worse. I also asked about how much mothers were spending on their bikes, and this was quite interesting, and it kind of ties back to the high income of the majority of mothers that took part in the research, in that mothers were spending quite a lot on cycling equipment. And I know, like, some of the cargo bikes, particularly the e-assist, you can spend anything from like £3,000 up to £6,000 depending on the accessories you have, and kind of raised some interesting points as to maybe that's why lower income families are being priced out of cycling. Obviously, you can get really cheap bikes, but often cheap children's bikes that are cheap are really heavy and they're not particularly pleasant to use. And then similarly with cycle parking, again, I thought this was really interesting because there's been lots of research in the past that has shown that a lack of storage at home or for your end destination is a real barrier to people taking up cycling, or if they've had bikes stolen because they've had nowhere to store them at home and they've left them outside. But actually, again, for the mothers who took part in this research, it wasn't a particular issue for them. Most people could store their bikes in garages or in their home, and that again links back to maybe that affluent nature of the mothers taking part. That's definitely something that needs to be looked at to try and help more people cycle from lower income groups in particular. I then looked at sort of the organisational skills that were needed to cycle with a child. And I think some people would say that if you're a parent or a mother anyway, you're always multitasking, you always have to think about what you're doing. But I really feel that when you're cycling, that just takes it to another level, because you often have to think about the different types of weathers when you're cycling. I know it's difficult sometimes to get children into cars, but if you're managing children of different ages and trying to get them to cycle together, that can be really problematic. And actually, that was one of the things that I found really interesting about this research, because I only have one child, and actually he's quite sensible, he's quite compliant, he likes rules. So generally, if we were cycling, even when he was like 4 or 5, if I said slow down or watch out for that dog, he generally would. But it turns out not all children are like that, and some of the mothers are like, I love my children, but my goodness, they get so distracted, and actually that does have an impact on where we can safely cycle with them. And one of the mothers like, we just can't do certain routes because I know my 6-year-old, the 4-year-old's fine, but the 6-year-old just doesn't listen, and it's just too dangerous. And then also, if you've got children of different ages, so if you've got a 5-year-old and a 10-year-old, just from a physical point of view, they're going to have different levels of endurance, and they're going to be, the 10-year-old is likely to be much faster than the 5-year-old. So just again, that logistics of keeping them together can be quite problematic. And then the other thing, and this was something that I had experienced, was that as your child grows, you have to change the way you cycle with them. So for many of the mothers, where they had children maybe like under 3, which could, so they could carry them on bike seats or in trailers, but once they get to a certain weight, they then can no longer use that form of cycle equipment. So unless they can afford a cargo bike, which even though many of the mothers were affluent, a lot of them couldn't afford a cargo bike or didn't have anywhere to store it, they then actually found themselves in that sort of in-between stage where the child was too big to sit on the back of a bike, but they were too young to be able to cycle like a mile or 2 miles to nursery, and it wasn't safe for them because although they mastered the art of cycling, they didn't have the road sense to be able to cycle on the road, or even just among other people walking and things. So again, that was a real issue. So just very quickly, some sort of policy ideas of what we can do. And I don't think any of these will be a surprise, but we need to have better infrastructure that actually meets the needs of mothers. So things like cycle superhighways are great, but they generally are aimed at transporting people from A to B. And we know that mothers' journeys are not like that. They're going from A to B to D to C to A again. So we need to maybe look more at like local connectivity and making those routes sort of just join up in the local area. But also those routes have to be safe. And I know Kate is going to talk a bit more about how cycle paths, particularly shared use paths through parks and things, aren't always safe for women at certain times of the day. So that's really key to think of as well. We need to remove the barriers off shared use paths. They're just really unhelpful for anyone who has like a non-standard bike. So people with disabilities who use bikes as their mobility aid, but just generally, even people with pushchairs, they're an absolute nightmare. And it feels like that's an easy thing to do. Solution for cycle parking. So let's start taking away car parking spaces, put bike hangers on so that for people who do live in flats or terrace houses, they know that they can have somewhere safe for their bike to be secured. Reduce the cost of cycling. Those cargo bikes that a lot of people could replace a car with, use as a second car, they're very expensive. And previously the government has subsidised people to buy electric vehicles. Why not do it with electric bikes? And then allow people to try out cycling equipment. So there's a lot of bike libraries that are springing up around the UK where people can go and test out a bike seat or a trailer or a cargo bike. And that's really important because this equipment is expensive and you don't want to make a mistake or realise that you don't have somewhere safe to store it. And then very quickly, my last two slides, we've got a very toxic cycling culture in the UK, and that often means that cycling isn't seen as something that women would do because we've often got this lycra louts and, it's not for me, you have to be masculine, you have to have athleticism to cycle, and that's just not true. So we need to sort of start just sharing more images, trying to get more people cycling, and fight against that narrative of cyclists are bad as well. And in line with that, just trying to get more justice for cyclists where we ensure that dangerous and careless driving is continually reported and acted upon so people realise they can't get away with treating cyclists and vulnerable road users badly. And then I promise this is my final slide. Something that came out was that a lot of women who don't cycle are not confident cyclists. And so if you've not been a confident cyclist as a child, a teenager, and then into your adulthood, it's very unlikely that you're then going to suddenly go, oh yeah, well, I'll just cycle on the road with my 2-year-old on a back of a child seat. So we need more cycle training, leg rise, just anything that can help build confidence for more women to cycle. And then also, I've already said about ensuring infrastructure is better and it meets the needs of mothers. But we need to be able to have young children who are transitioning from being carried on a bike to cycling themselves to be able to be on infrastructure that allows them to make the odd mistake and it not be fatal. Okay, I am done. So I will now pass over to Kate. Is that okay?
Thank you, Dawn. Hi, everybody. Before I get going, I'll probably just clarify that this piece of research was carried out by the London Cycling Campaign Women's Network. But as a PhD student, I brought some of my Active Travel Academy research knowledge to bear, working with a group of great volunteers, and we all work together to produce this report. I'll also say this is a research, I'm going to be talking about the research we did, but I'm also going to say this is not a kind of totally academic piece of research. It's much more of a campaigning focus, and so please expect that focus as we go through this. Next slide, please. Background to this investigation of what stops of women cycling after dark. The background was an earlier survey done by the London Cycle Campaign Women's Network. That report is accessible on the website. The link is at the end of this presentation. I'd encourage you to look at that report. But one of the findings from that really hit us, and it was around what we call social safety. We found that 1 in 3 women stop cycling when it starts getting dark early. And women also reported having faced this impossible choice between routes with high volumes of fast-moving traffic presenting danger, or a quiet, somewhat isolated route that feels unsafe. So this was something we wanted to find out more about this. Next slide, please. So we completely acknowledge that women need physical safety from the dangers of motorist traffic, but what we wanted to look at was the social safety side of this, about women feeling at risk of violence, abuse, and harassment. In terms of how we decided to look at this, clearly, and I think the previous 2 presenters have talked about some of the societal and cultural factors. And one of the issues that women bring with them every day when they cycle is a knowledge of the level of violence against women. I'm not going to tackle the whole kind of behavioral, cultural aspect of it, but what we chose to look at is the fact that infrastructure very definitely contributes to this feeling of not being safe on cycling infrastructure. Next slide, please. We decided really to just try and understand the extent of the problem, or at least get some sort of scale to it. And to do that, rather than looking at all of the cycle infrastructure in London, looking at all of women's experience of feeling socially unsafe, we would focus very clearly on Transport for London's strategic cycle network. That's the thing that's actually published on their website. And all the cycleways there have been approved and should be safe for everyone to cycle all day and all year round. We decided to find out, are they actually safe for everyone? That's what our research was about. Next, please. Our process, we have a great women's network with a lot of people who are keen to participate in this. We recruited and trained a number of volunteers. I think it was about 20 volunteers, put together a training pack, webinar, etc., for them to act as route assessors. And what they did was ride and analyze the routes on the TfL cycle network, where possible at night. What actually happened was, in a number of occasions, women got together in a group to cycle, as they didn't feel particularly safe doing so by themselves. We asked them to identify unsafe sections, and also against a list of different characteristics to record the type of area, the features of the unsafe sections. And we also did a peer review of the results for each cycleway to ensure consistency, or a level of consistency across assessors. Next slide, please. In the previous slide, I probably glossed a little over what it was they were assessing in order to identify unsafe sections. We had a lot of debate about this, but what we concluded was that what stops somebody from cycling, stops them from using a cycleway, is that they feel unsafe. They don't stop cycling specifically because of the lighting or because of the overgrown bushes. It's probably a combination of a whole bunch of factors. And what we really wanted to focus on was, do you feel unsafe? And then look at some of the characteristics they recorded of those unsafe stretches, so that we could learn a little bit more about perhaps what contributed towards that feeling of a lack of safety. Next, please. So here we have the first bit of our findings, which is the cycleway network. The cycleways are a combination of the red bits, which are the bits that our assessors found to be unsafe after dark, and the blue bits, which they found to be safe. I'll go through some more statistics and facts about this, but I think the impression that I trust you get from this is clear that there is quite a lot which is unsafe. Thank you. Moving on to the next one. Here are some of the features that people recorded on those unsafe sections. Perhaps not surprisingly, 65% were either in or alongside parks or green spaces. But it's not all about being in parks, and I think you can tell from the numbers here, these different characteristics are not mutually exclusive. Quite a lot were actually on the cycling area was either part of the carriageway or beside the carriageway. So it wasn't all about just being in the midst of a park. And then there were other common features, industrial areas, which I think we saw cycleways where they felt pretty safe during the day when those industrial units were in use and there was a certain amount of traffic, although that did sometimes bring more of a physical safety issue to cycling. But when you went along those areas at night, they were often pretty much deserted. So a number of different features there that we observed. Next slide. Some of these are perhaps slightly more subjective, but pretty significant. A lot of unsafe sections were about a lack of people being around or a lack of nearby buildings overlooking the cycleway. And comments also here, a lot of them were no escape route. You'd have a path with high fences or walls on either side, so you just felt you would be unable to get away if anything started happening. So a number of features there. The last one I'll point out there is tunnel. Could probably better be labeled tunnel, overpass, underpass. Quite often on the sections we found unsafe, the cycleways were either passing over or under a major road, a railway line, etc. And it seemed that I think many of us will have seen those kind of cycling and walking structures that take you over a busy road. They're often completely enclosed and with lots of blind corners and pretty narrow. So that was quite a common feature that came up. We'll move on to the next one, please. So looking back to that map, we now have the answer as to what percentage of the cycle network did our assessors find to be unsafe. The answer being nearly a quarter of the TfL cycle network was assessed as being unsafe. In addition, over half of the cycleways have at least one unsafe section. And I think when you look at those two together, it's the end result is possibly worse than those figures suggest, because a little bit of safe cycleway surrounded by two unsafe segments probably doesn't make it a very useful thing to include in your route when you're cycling. The other thing there, which is interesting, was that actually 7 cycleways were 100% unsafe after dark. That seemed to be often the result of an existing path that had been designated as a cycleway. Probably very little, if any, work had been done to make it into a cycleway. It was just sort of putting the labels and popping it on the map. Great example of that is the Grand Union Canal cycleway, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Another one is the Greenway, a 7-kilometre path, actually built on an embankment that covers one of London's main Victorian sewers. And the path has existed for many years, but was then designated as part of the cycle network. And it's a wide open space, but its very nature of it being an embankment means that it's very difficult to exit the path if one feels uncomfortable if something is happening. And also, again, because it's elevated, nobody except the few people that may be on that path at night can see what's happening on that. There are no houses or buildings that could overlook it. So overall, I think what we found, going back to the comments on our earlier survey, is that absolutely there is a pretty substantial problem with the cycleways in London not feeling safe. As LCC, we thought, well, how has this happened? Why is so much of the network unsafe? The first point is pretty simple, that there are cycle quality criteria that are used by TfL to assess and approve funding for new cycleways. And those criteria are great at looking at issues of volumes of traffic, speed of traffic, risks from turning maneuvers, volumes of HGVs, all those things, and they result in quite a lot of good consideration of the physical danger to cyclists, and the result is a lot of new cycleways have been built which have some pretty good protected space that really reduces that physical danger. But there's simply no requirement in there to consider social safety, and perhaps inevitably, as social safety isn't considered, we end up with some of the cycleways we have. I think a second factor, and I mean, it was news to me as we started assessing this, just how much of the cycleways go through parks. Possibly more as you get further out from the centre of London. I live pretty centrally in London, but when you looked at ones that go further out, so many of them are using existing pathways through parks. I think if you look at it from a local authority point of view, it's probably much cheaper to put your cycleway through a park, minimal or no new infrastructure required, no cost. And secondly, you don't have to deal with potential resistance to the reallocation of road space from other road users to cycling. The third factor that I think we had experienced as a campaigning organisation is that when a proposal for a cycleway comes out, we can see that that cycleway is much better than not having a cycleway, but it will sometimes contain features that we don't particularly like. But nonetheless, you know, we will at a level support the building of that. And then we find that once that cycleway is built, it's very difficult then to get the local authorities to go back and look at the cycleway and improve it. It tends to be tick, it's done, it's on the map. So there were a number of factors here that we identified that were really contributing to us ending up with a lot of the network that has these far from ideal features. Before I go on to what we're actually kind of asking for to happen, I just quickly want to show you a couple of examples. So if we can move on to the next one. So this is the Grand Union Canal, which I mentioned, 23 kilometres. It's what you see. It is the towpath with the features you'd expect to see on a towpath, that it's narrow, it's enclosed, often with vegetation at the side, and definitionally a canal on the other side of the path. Also, being a canal, there's often industrial buildings surrounding it as well, which will be unlikely to be occupied at night and don't necessarily provide any reassurance to somebody cycling along it. So in our work, we actually struggled to find anyone amongst our network who used this as a cycle route, and several commented that they wouldn't even use it during the day because it just did not feel safe. Next slide, please. This is another cycleway, largely off-road in South London. I think possibly this is the cycleway that attracts the most attention in the press in terms of reported muggings and bike thefts. It's got railways sort of alongside it, industrial buildings, and the Millwall football ground, but all of it leads to something which is very isolated, heavily used nonetheless, because actually the alternative roads in the area are really unpleasant to cycle, so people do still choose to use this. And indeed, one of our network actually reported they had been told by the police not to use it because it wasn't safe. So that is another example of one of the cycleways on the network. Okay, last slide. I'll just really highlight three of the points here. First, we would like to address TfL to address this by adding social safety to their cycle route quality criteria, so it is explicit that it has to be considered. The third point there, TfL should not approve or fund council delivery of routes that do not meet the updated criteria, i.e. including social safety. And the fifth point I'll highlight here is about developing new guidance on cycle infrastructure and social safety. I talked about the problems of kind of bridges, tunnels, overpasses. That's something where I think some more careful thought about good infrastructural solutions is worthwhile. I think the last thing I want to add is that what we haven't really come to is a perfect definition of how you build a cycleway to make it socially safe. And indeed, the suggestion is perhaps it may be more of a process of getting people to look at and review areas to say whether they will feel safe. And next week, I'm pleased to report that a number of us will be attending a session organised by representatives of TfL to apply a process that they have developed called the Women's Safety Audit. It's been developed to look at all sorts of aspects of built environment and assess them for their safety. But they're now looking to apply it to a new cycleway which has been proposed in Brent. So we're very interested in looking at that and seeing how that kind of a process can fit in to supporting the idea of social safety being considered as part of the planning of a new cycleway. So in conclusion, social safety is an issue. The cycleways that we have in place are not sufficiently safe, and we'd like to see that change. Thank you very much for listening. I'll now pass back to Dom.
Thanks, Kate, and thanks to all our speakers. Really interesting stuff there. If I could invite you all back on screen, because I think we've got some questions which I'd like to put. Yeah, I'm gonna kick off with a couple of my own, if that's all right, and then we'll come on to some from the chat. We've got, and I think we advertised this until 3:15. So if you've got a 3 o'clock meeting, feel free to jump off. But we'll be continuing on through with a few questions. Yeah, so I guess probably to Robbie, perhaps to start with. Obviously, your research is undertaken in Irish secondary schools. So I've got a couple of questions on transferability, and wondered to what extent you think your findings are applicable to children in schools here in the UK and perhaps globally. And secondly, do you think that the same gender barriers remain after school into adulthood, as found in your research?
Yeah, thanks very much for the question, Dom. Yeah, so I think first of all, the gender gap, to my knowledge, I haven't looked at this research in some time, but to my knowledge, it's quite similar in the UK amongst teenage girls and between teenage girls and boys. And then in terms of the built environments as well, I think the likes of London and Dublin are trying to roll out more cycling infrastructure, but a lot of parts of Ireland have very little, if any, and a lot of it would be the likes of painted cycleways or cycle lanes as opposed to segregated cycling infrastructure. So yeah, and then when you look at the likes of the uniform policies as well around mandatory skirt wearing or having an option for trousers, but it not being a particularly attractive option or co-designed with the teenage girls in the schools, you have similar problems there as well. And then in terms of the actual study itself, for anyone who reads it, there is a lot of research cited in that has looked at other contexts like the likes of I believe Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and I think there may be some UK research in there as well that talks about things like the kind of stigma around sweating, and as well the stigma around wearing particular kinds of cycling equipment as well. So I think there is a good deal of transferability, considering this was a national study looking at many different kind of cycling contexts, but quite similar gender norms, even though you had these very urban contexts as opposed to these more rural locations.
Yeah, great. And you mentioned uniform there, which actually Felicity in the chat has picked up on as well. And actually, you mentioned Canada as well, and she's joining from Canada, so that's good. So she was wondering to what extent just changing uniform requirements would have an impact. Do you think? Is there an opportunity there?
Yeah, so this was actually a kind of, I suppose, a big theory at the beginning of the research, that maybe this could be like one of the big policy actions outside of the broader ones to just make cycling safer from a kind of traffic safety perspective to schools for all teenagers. But yeah, one of the difficulties in this particular study was actually that a lot of the teenage girls, some of them did have trouser options, but were very uncomfortable wearing trousers, as that was seen as dressing like a boy, and that could also be stigmatized in some cases too. So some didn't use those options, and then others, even if they were, like some weren't actually demanding it. And I think there was in the study again, I think there's a study cited inside the research that looks at a Netherlands context, where I believe there are some schools that actually do have skirts, and step through bikes are a lot more common. So there is this kind of these different kinds of cycling cultures. So it's a more open and universal cycling culture. So I guess in some respects, this kind of mandatory need to wear trousers, or making trousers a lot easier and making trousers the norm. You could argue in some respects a more inclusive cycling culture should enable you to wear whatever the hell you want, really, if you're cycling. So yeah.
Yeah. Thanks. Interesting. And I was going to pick up with Dawn. You mentioned the importance of infrastructure, and the sort of typical A to B cycle superhighway style routes not necessarily being suited to mothers' trip patterns. And I wondered, what do you think mum-friendly cycling infrastructure looks like?
Oh, that's a tricky one. I mean, I think it's just, we need to think about the journeys that they are making. And so obviously superhighways are great if that's on a route that a mother happens to be needing to use. But I think it's not necessarily about, I mean, obviously if money was no question, and where I live in Leamington and Warwick. Somewhere like Warwick, it's a market town, there's very little space. It would be very difficult to engineer lots of, lovely, safe infrastructure. But it's even just about opening up. I feel there's, again, where I cycle, there's lots of desire lines that could just be easy fixes that just allow people to sort of nip between, I'm saying A to B, even though I'm saying mothers don't travel from A to B. But it's just, even just making what we already have just better. So removing those barriers, because a lot of the mothers, they couldn't, and again, I had this where I wanted to cycle through a nature reserve with my son because it cut out a 2-mile journey, which was on a horrible road, but it had those horrible A-frames and I couldn't get my cargo bike through it. So something as simple as just removing those barriers actually in itself opens up lots of different areas. Even just, but then also in the lack of infrastructure, I really think we need to work on the whole sort of the cycling culture. The fact that mothers are being abused by other road users for daring to cycle on a road, it's just, that's wrong on so many levels. Now, obviously, yes, we probably don't want 3 and 4-year-olds cycling on busy roads, but mothers using cargo bikes, or even mothers using trailers or bike seats, that should be absolutely acceptable. And just, I still feel we just have, it's not just about the infrastructure. Obviously, infrastructure is important, but this toxic cycling culture that we have, and I don't know how we break that down, other than we just start getting really strict with people who are abusing vulnerable road users. And I mean, obviously there's been some, I feel like there's been some good advances recently with the sort of the extra emphasis on cyclists must be passed with 1.5 meters. But then you I always say don't read the comments on social media, because you go on like social media where there's a story about a cyclist There was one the other day which I read where 4 cyclists had been hit by someone who was drunk driving, and the comments were like, "Well, why were they on that road?" It's like, you know, so it's we need to do a mixture of things. We need to fix this toxic cycling culture, just make cycling more normalised, and where we can improve the infrastructure, that would be great.
Yeah, I do wonder whether 20 mile an hour has a significant role to play here. I was on an interesting webinar last week around the findings from Wales, and there's some really good data coming out of Wales now showing significant casualty reduction from that. And in fact, one of the speakers was from an insurance company saying that was the single most significant reduction in casualties that they'd seen, and actually they were able to reduce people's premiums across the board. So that kind of affecting that culture-wide change that's kind of important for making cycling infrastructure that isn't actually physically segregated working.
Yeah, and actually one of the mothers that I interviewed, she was saying that where she lives in London, they'd got a couple of school streets and then a low traffic neighbourhood, and what that had actually done with very little infrastructure had actually allowed her son to be able to cycle to school on his own. And it was, you know, because it had kind of created this safe network of routes, and actually that hadn't required a lot of expense and a lot of physical infrastructure. But she said she was now comfortable letting him cycle to school because he could go on those routes.
Yeah, thanks. To Kate, a lot of the issues that you mentioned related to off-road routes in parks and things, and I wondered whether you thought we should simply be saying that prioritising investment in traffic-free cycling infrastructure away from roads should stop because those aren't inclusive, or do you feel that there are ways that we can make off-road routes 24/365 accessible to all users?
Yeah, I think first of all, off-road routes are great during the day, and that serves all sorts of useful purposes. And I'm sure Dawn will find with lots of kind of mothers taking kids to and from school and stuff, the off-road route would be the choice. And some of the things that I've marked as unsafe would be perfect during the daytime to cycle with children. But as to can they be made safe, some can be. But you know, if you are right in the middle, if the path is right in the middle of a large park, you know, no amount of lighting will necessarily change the situation because you're still going to be at night very isolated from everybody else. You know, there won't be that much footfall. So I think there can be some improvements within some of the existing paths that go through parks, etc. But I think that a lot of it should be thinking about building routes that will be safe 24/7, and are probably much more about using either protected space, creating protected space on the carriageway, or just reducing to an acceptable level the volume and speed of traffic on the carriageway to enable cycling. So yeah, it's not an absolute no, but I think you have to think very carefully and be very sure before you put a cycleway into a park. There need to be alternatives for those parts of the route.
Yeah, okay. Thanks for that. I'm going to come to a few more of the ones from the chat now. There's a couple about cycle training. I think Jermaine's question was probably mainly intended for you, Robbie, but others can come in on it. Just whether cycle training came up in your study as a significant barrier, or sorry, a significant enabler of girls cycling to school. Oh, I think you're muted, Robbie.
All right.
Yeah, we're going.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah,
okay,
we
great.
can hear you.
Yeah. There was with that fourth gender norm that I talked about, caution. That came up quite a bit, which was a real kind of concern around compliance with the rules of the road. Kind of like what Dom was talking about with the mothers cycling and being really concerned or feeling really guilty about cycling on the pavement. So training wasn't talked about by any of the teenage girls or the teenage boys to any great extent, but there was a real emphasis of not knowing how to cycle on the road and what that required, and that didn't come up at all with the teenage boys in the focus group.
Dawn, was that a significant area of discussion in your research?
It wasn't with the questionnaires and the interviews. We did talk about it quite a bit in the focus group. So some of the people in the focus group work with like low-income families and ethnic minority groups, and they definitely expressed that cycle training was adult cycle training particularly, and even family cycle training where they could cycle with their children and learn how to ride with a bike seat was really important. And I think that is really important because, as I said before, if you're not a confident cyclist as cycling on your own, you're not just going to then start taking children along. I also think with the bikeability at schools, from my son's experience, so he did it in year 4 where they do like the playground sessions and get to learn all skills and taking the hand off, and then in year 6 they do it where they actually go on the roads. The problem I find with that is that doesn't actually then make parents think, oh, I'll let my child cycle to school, because the route they're cycling to school hasn't had any changes to it. And so I think that what would be really useful there, and I know that I can't remember which organisation does it, but I know that some do, where you actually do family cycle training. So you get the parents to come along and learn to cycle the route to school. And I think that is actually much more useful. But absolutely, I feel like adult cycle training is a really useful tool, particularly because a lot of them can actually choose a journey that they're going to make and show them like the ways that they should navigate that route. But it didn't come up other than in the focus groups.
Right, thanks, Dawn. And Cara in the chat was asking around bikeability and whether that was offered across all areas of England. I can give you my understanding, Cara, which is that in theory all children are supposed to be offered it, but I think the reality is that probably only about 50% from the data I've just had a quick Google of actually do it, for a variety of reasons around take up and different local authorities having different policies on it, etc. But I know that Active Travel England had a commitment to support all children to offer it to all children, but I suspect the reality is somewhat different from that. Dawn, I wanted to ask you as well. It's very apparent that all your participants are very sort of motivated, enthusiast cyclists, sort of cycling enthusiast parents. You can kind of imagine some of them are probably campaigners and very into cycling, and that's why they're doing it. And I'm guessing that's indicative of the fact that generally, not just women in your research, but women generally who are cycling with their children tend to fit that demographic. And how can we mainstream this? What actions should we be taking to make it more normal?
Yeah, I mean, it was so apparent, and even my own experience is that, as I said, it's just not, and it's for some people it might be, but very few people have a direct route from where they live to where they want to go that is cycle friendly. And it's just really hard work. You do have to plan to the nth degree, and you want it to be enjoyable, but you're also, I always use the analogy, like if my son was hurt playing football and broke his leg, no one would bat an eyelid. But if he was knocked off his bike and we were on a road and he broke his leg that way, I just feel like that judgment that would ensue. And I feel that's the issue. It's like I think mothers are scared to cycle with their children because they're worried about what might happen, and that's completely understandable because it's not always pleasant to cycle on roads, and then there is also that whole thing of the logistics of working, trying to cycle. So a lot of the mothers were cycling their children to school and then cycling on to work. But for some people, it's just an alien concept, isn't it? Because if they're not already cycling, they'll just be like, that's not achievable for me. I do think that obviously some of this research took part directly after COVID, and a lot of the mothers were increasingly working from home and not having to travel to their office. So that sort of flexible working did help them. But I still feel like We've got to capture them sort of younger. You know, the fact that a lot of children will cycle, but then, as Robbie said, teenage girls in particular, they just have that break, and we, as they're teenagers, and we know that in terms of travel behaviour, if you break that habit, it's harder to go back into it. So, I mean, I think people are doing the right things. We're sort of chipping away. There's lots of cycle groups that are doing adult cycle training and offering led rides. I keep wanting to, I don't want to say it's just about infrastructure, but the infrastructure is really important, because until people feel safe that they can safely cycle with their children, they're just not going to do it.
I guess a summary perhaps would be it's about infrastructure and culture, and that's a virtuous circle, isn't it? And that they feed each other. Thank you all very much. We're coming up to 1:15 now, so I am going to wrap up. But yeah, a virtual round of applause and vote of thanks to Robbie, Kate, and Dawn for joining us today and giving up your time. Thanks to everyone who's joined us as well. The next webinar in this series is on the 27th of March, where we'll be exploring innovative strategies to address the challenges of improper e-scooter parking and improving public perceptions of shared e-scooter programs. If you haven't yet registered, please look out for the follow-up emails. Everybody that's on this webinar should get one, and you'll find a link to sign up in that email. Thanks for joining us today, everyone. Really hope you found it engaging and interesting, and a fitting way of marking International Women's Day in the active travel planning industry. Thanks very much, and bye for now.